place they came to was dark, both in illumination and in aspect. The winding pathways were treacherous and the company murderous. In these straggling streets, sin and vice flourished, with thief, heavy, prostitute, and backstreet surgeon living uneasily, cheek by jowl. In the very heart of this locale there sat, or perhaps I should say squatted, a dark and shuttered shop. No sign hung upon its door, no cheerful bell rang out upon the entering of it, and no produce was displayed in the windows. Marley and Scrooge entered this dismal Aladdin's cave, for inside it was filled to the brim with the spoils of nefarious practices, each sorted and piled up into some sort of order. There were mounds of keys next to rusting locks, stacks of wallets and books. A barrel of fat and bones sat in one corner, and blackened bottles high upon a shelf across from it. Skittering between these piles was a man, low and bent, but who moved with vigour, his shirt tails flapping, long grey hair straggling down his back, and yellow smoke of his pipe marking his passage. He sorted his stock as he went, moving produce from one place to another according to his whims. Marley became aware of other figures in the shop. A woman with a bundle clutched close to her chest, then another who was similarly laden, and a man, sallow of complexion, in a faded black suit. That they knew each other was of no doubt. Neither was the fact that they'd not expected to meet each other in this place. Oh, why, we should have hired a coach and four and saved on the wear of our shoe leather, cackled one of the women. All three took up to laughing upon the instant. The old man, who'd been attending the piles like an erratic spider, popped his head out of a jumble of rags that he'd been sorting at the noise.
Ooh. How now? What's this? We'll have no trouble here, he sputtered with mock indignation. If it's jollity and frivolity you're wanting, I suggest you go to the Three Cripples and take a scoop of gin or whatever papa is your fancy, and not sully my good place of business with your levity.
There was a silence, and then the company dissolved into more laughter.
Oh, Joseph, said the second of the two women. I'll take you down there myself once you've paid for today's spoils. Now, Mrs. Dilber, we are getting a little ahead of ourselves, aren't we? Said the man called Joe. Let's make sure we aren't disturbed. He wheedled his way first to the door to lock it, and then all around the space, clicking and tripping hidden catches and clasps, evidently barring the ingresses that the other three had used. Charwoman first, cried the other lady, as all four congregated in a little space at the back of the shop. This space was dominated by a vast carved desk that looked very out of place amongst all this squalor, a small stove, a tar-marked black chair. Marley guided Scrooge towards the tableau. As you wish, Ivy, said Joe, as he pattered after her and took his place behind the table. I'm ever one for tradition, especially at such an auspicious event as this one. Laundress second, cried Mrs. Dilber. And I suppose that would leave you for last, then, old Sourface, said Joe. Sourface nodded, displaying not one ounce of resentment at the name that fitted him so very well. After all, it is tradition that you should have the last of us, eh? Again, just a nod. With a great flourish, Ivy, the laundress, flung her bundle of fabric out onto the table and put her hands on her hips in a gesture of triumph. Now, come then, Ivy. This is to be a sombre and respectful affair, said Joe as he examined the goods. Oh, but these are rare and fine items, parted from the hands of that old gentleman, and each one a treasure indeed. Ivy, my dear, would these be his bed curtains? Ivy laughed. Took 'em down even while he was still cooling, she said. Joe made an impressed whistle, then chalked a price on the table. Ivy gave a curt nod of her head, and Joe produced the coins from the depths of his coat. Marley understood upon the moment what these three were about. They were grave robbers, but ones who took the goods and left the body. Aye, he kept everything keen and close, that one, said Ivy, as she took her pay. Why, I'm surprised that he isn't haunting us now for the very taking of them. The dead can't hurt you, said Sourface, and all started, including Scrooge and Marley, to hear the sepulchral tones. Oh, you? Very true, Mr. S, and none more qualified to confirm that statement than you, I'm sure, said Mrs. Dilber, as she laid out her spoils. A mantel clock, a few silver pieces from a tea set, some repaired and re-repaired boots, and a nightshirt. When Marley saw the nightshirt, he recognised it at once, for its very twin was adorning the body of Scrooge as they stood there. Yet Scrooge seemed not to have made the same connection. Joe chalked Mrs. Dilber's bounty in the same manner as Ivy's. And who's the worse for the loss of a few things like these? Continued Mrs. Dilber. I mean, not a dead man, I suppose. No, there's no pockets in shrouds, least none that the three of us can't pick, agreed Ivy. And if he'd wanted them looking after, then why wasn't he natural with people in his lifetime? If he had been, then he might have had somebody to look after him when he was struck with death, instead of lying, gasping out his last alone by himself. Joe slid a fistful of coins across the table at Mrs. Dilber, who grabbed them up greedily. You are indeed a sage, Ivy, said Joe. It would have been wise to keep your counsel. All turned to the man in faded black as he scattered a paltry haul of knickknacks on the table. A seal or two, a pencil case, a pair of sleeve buttons, and a brooch of no great value. Joe sucked at his few remaining teeth and chalked a price on the tabletop. That's all I can give you, Mr. S, said Joe. Can I take it that your inestimable wife was in attendance this morning? Sourface nodded as he gathered the coins from the table. Don't give him another sixpence, Joe. It will be bitter charity, said Mrs. Dilber, as the sallow man pocketed the coins disconsolately. It's enough to get you good and soused, dear. That's all you need, I suspect. They're ghouls, Spirit, whispered Scrooge, scavenging the leavings of some poor soul's life. Marley had to agree. Take me from them, said Scrooge. I would see no more. See no more, thought Marley. They are stealing the shirt from your back and the clock from your mantle, and that you failed to see it. It was infuriating. Well, Marley would make him see. He vowed it. He swung the scythe across the scene. The spoils on the table were transformed into a corpse, very similar in aspect to Scrooge himself. The grave robbers that stood over it were now giant rats with sharp teeth and greedy eyes, whilst Joe was now an impossibly large spider huddled in the chair. There was a moment when the rats descended on the corpse, ripping it to pieces and then feeding it piecemeal to the spider. Scrooge made to look away, but Marley pointed towards the scene once more. As the spider ate what the rats gave it, it produced a golden thread that it attached to each of the rats in turn, binding them to him. It was an orgy of greed and rapaciousness that even Marley found hard to stomach. It's just a play, just an allegory, he kept saying to himself. It's not real.
But he found himself wondering whether this was not the actual nature of reality, and whatever covering he'd torn away was simply a modesty veil for the truth. A scraping sound and then a clunk took Marley's attention for a moment. It came from underneath the shelf with the burnt and blackened bottles upon it. He looked and saw in the corner what at first he assumed to be just a pile of scrap metal chains. But as he peered closer, he saw that just at the top there was a face looking out. Checking that Scrooge was well and truly engrossed in the bloody banquet, he moved over to the chains. Once closer, he could see that they were indeed spectral in nature, but they were larger and heavier than any others he'd ever seen. Though, as he looked, he realized he recognized the face of the one who bore them. It was that lady whose glass he'd fallen into all those years back at the gathering in the fire-ravaged brewery. Yet, he remembered her chains back then, and they'd been lighter than his, much lighter, nothing like as great as these monstrosities. "A drink, Governor, I beg you, a drink," she gasped. And then he had it, remembering how after the party his chains had returned just that little bit heavier than before, and how in that moment he'd wished for just one more drink to lighten his load. Evidently, this poor wretch had done just that, gone from drink to spectral drink, not caring a jot for her burdens, ignoring them, until one day they returned, and in such a form that they weighed her down completely. Above her, on the shelf, was a blackened sherry barrel. Perhaps it held enough liquor to dissolve her burden for a while. But, thought Marley, if I were to cut the tap off and let it pour into her upturned mouth, I would only be making her burden more heavier in the end. He considered shattering the chains in the same way that he had the bankers, but again, would she not just take back to the drink and grow those chains all over again? And was this even a decision that Marley had the right to take for another? He ruminated upon this, and then believed he came up with a solution. With a scythe, he nicked a small piece out of the bottom of the barrel, and the smallest drop of ghostly spirit began to form. The woman started to cry that he was taunting her, and he was crueler than the devil. Marley bent down to be closer to her face and whispered in her ear. "I'm not attempting to be evil," he said, as the drip fell from the barrel. It touched the woman's lips and she sighed. "I am trying to give you a choice. You can get relief one drip at a time, or you could hold your mouth open and not swallow until you have enough to make all your chains vanish away in one gulp. If I was you, I'd choose the former, as I'd wager that way they may just shrink away until you never knew they were such a burden. The other way will only give them more power and more hold over you." He watched as another drip formed and fell. The woman held it in her mouth for a moment, defiant fury in her eyes, and then swallowed it down. A tiny wisp of mist rose from one link of the chains. If the chain had grown any smaller, it was by a degree that Marley could not detect. He left her to her fate, like an hourglass that would take many months, if not years, to run its course. He hoped she had the strength to hold out. Scrooge was watching the last moments of the banquet in horror. The rats, having sometime before finished all the morsels on the table, were now cocooned in a golden thread, dangling from the ceiling and snapping at each other. "Spirit," said Scrooge, "let me not see these visions. Man does not have to prey on man so. How I wish I could pay my respects to this poor soul who they've robbed. Show me something connected with this poor man's death that has some warmth, some depth of happiness. I beg you." The bones left on the table caught Marley's eye, and the skull turned towards him. It had been picked clean of everything but its eyes. These were eyes that Marley knew all too well. Keen, shrewd, and as blue as sapphires they were. The eyes of the unrevenged king. Marley was now convinced he was being pursued by the director. No doubt to recast the role Marley had taken on himself. But this was not Marley's preferred outcome. Right at this moment, Scrooge was gibbering at his side, clutching onto his cloak, and having brought his partner this far to the edge of madness, he wanted to see this to the end. So, as the rats bobbed like marionettes and the bloated and bloody Spider Joe gave a meaty laugh, Marley brought the scythe round in a great sweeping arc and cut through them all four, sweeping them and the scene.